When I set out to create these videos, I don't do so with the objective of trying to prove myself right in light of current events. And in recent videos, I was talking about the links between Brexit and the migrant crisis and the issue of integrity when carrying out negotiations. Those two videos seem very topical right now in view of the latest news that tragically nearly 30 migrants died yesterday crossing the Channel, and that Prime Minister Johnson had managed to make the situation even worse by sending a letter to President Macron in France. So all of these issues are related, and I couldn't resist talking about that. So for the first thing I'll say is we have a letter, and I will link to that letter. It's published on the government's own website in the video description below, so you can look at it for yourself. So let's have a look about the letter. We never get to see these things, first of all. These sorts of letters are usually done discreetly in diplomatic channels. So this is a very rare opportunity to see the sort of thing that Johnson is sending to Macron, and I will dissect bits of it in a minute. But I wanted to make the point that the first rule of Fight Club is, of course, you don't talk about Fight Club. So, and that applies to negotiations as well. Now, be under no illusions, this whole migrant crisis is a negotiation between UK and France. It has to be. That's the only way you can solve it. You need to negotiate some kind of solution. And we have to ask ourselves, why has the UK government broken convention, broken precedent, and openly published a letter of this sort, which normally would never see the light of day? And this is great for us. We get to see this. We get to see Johnson's incompetence in full display. But that is not how government normally works. And so we can see that the French reaction, just to that alone, has been pure anger. And we'll come a little bit into that. But I think I'll go on to the next point, which is the context. And this links into my previous videos. Johnson is not seen as a man of integrity. And so by openly publishing this letter, the French see him as playing a PR game to the domestic audience in the UK. Now, we've had lots of discussions as a result of these videos, and even in the media, if you follow certain channels, that this current government is adopting policies that even 10 years ago would have been unthinkable. So, for example, the government policies of trying to return migrants, asylum seekers to countries without process are policies that would have only ever been proposed by parties like the British National Party. They would never have been proposed by any mainstream political party. So the French will be aware of that, and the French will have their own view. And they've got their own immigration pressures. They have their own far-right calls for how to treat asylum seekers and refugees and so on. So the fact that the UK government has not kept this private is seen as a means of applying pressure. It's also seen as being a means of being underhand, and I'll come on to that a little bit more as I dissect the letter. So the context is, we already have a bad relationship with the UK and France. It's terrible at this point. You don't really want to make it worse, especially if you actually need to solve a genuine problem. And migrants dying in the Channel is a genuine problem, regardless of all the arguments you want to make about it's been created by political policies. So that requires quiet diplomacy, as they say, to work through the issues. So when you look at the letter, and the first 1.5 pages or three-page letter is pretty much standard fluffiness, standard puffery that you get in these sorts of government correspondence. However, what you can see in there is a bit of emotional undertone, passive-aggressive perhaps. They're talking about obligations, commitments, conventions, and so on. So now that first 1.5 bit of the letter is not too problematic, despite a little bit of the underhand emotional blackmail to it. It's the usual sort of stuff. We need to work together and to solve the problem. So that is an opening sort of position, if you like, when you're trying to warm up for a negotiation, as it were. So let's look at that letter a little bit. So we have the first proposals in the bullet point form made by Johnson. And these actually aren't particularly, they're difficult, but they're not particularly problematic. So joint maritime or reciprocal patrols. This can be discussed. The UK and France traditionally had a very good defence and security relationship. So the concept of doing joint patrols in order to deal with a certain problem in itself is not unreasonable. The context, however, of the UK not being seen to be doing its fair share does put a certain slant on this. So that's the context that might alter perception in regards to the proposal. But the proposal itself is not necessarily problematic or unreasonable. The second one is to deploy more technologies and sensors. There could be various arguments of what's the point of doing that. They might be seen as problematic in certain other ways, technical ways and political ways. But again, that's another sort of proposal. This itself does not jump out as particularly problematic. It's something that can be discussed. The next one is reciprocal airborne surveillance. And I'm sure this happens anyway. I mean, the Channel is not exactly a particularly large body of water. And I've no doubt that UK and France do cooperate extensively when it comes to patrolling that waterway to make sure that they work together to rescue people who need rescuing, for example, to control traffic and so on. So again, this is not a proposal that looks particularly problematic on the face of it. And then, of course, we've got the final one of deepening the work of the Joint Intelligence Cell. And again, this is not particularly problematic. The UK and French intelligence agencies do work together. And of course, this is in reference to organised crime and human trafficking, which is undesirable, obviously, in any context. So both nations would want to work together to deal with that. So the first sort of nearly 2 pages of the letter is basically fluff and the proposals. And that itself is okay. It's not too problematic. And then we get to the real starting to cause problems part. And I'm going to quote, this is extracted directly from the letter. And this is where Johnson formally requests that we do, he carry on from the previous proposal, done the letter in June, I believe. I've not seen that letter. Don't think that's been published. But proposing joint patrols. Now this is going to be sensitive. That is not to say UK and France couldn't have such a sensitive discussion, but you would never do so openly. You try and keep this as low-key as possible. That is how you do these sorts of things. But of course, they've openly published this letter, which may well generate a certain reaction in France, for example, negative reaction. So, under single command structures, this is a bit like how military forces operate in the in various water operational theatres. So in some ways, what we're seeing here, when you put all these proposals together, you could almost construct a case that what Johnson's proposing is militarisation of the Channel. Okay, with border security people rather than military personnel, but that is kind of what comes across here. And that is going to trigger any kind of instinctive reaction from France to the thought of militarising the border, which was supposed to be an ally. Obviously, this is not North and South Korea. You don't deploy militarisation, but the technologies, the type of techniques, airborne assets, and all that sort of stuff that you use, and having a command structure, as a unified command structure, is a military sort of concept. So this is not. This is starting to get problematic. And then there's a real nasty one here. Private security contractors. So think about that a bit. There's 2 particular problems here. So private security contractors in the past would have been euphemism for mercenaries. These individuals are proposed to be deployed in France. So imagine that you're a French citizen and you're reading a letter from the UK Prime Minister saying we want to send mercenaries to patrol the territories of France. Yeah, that's really not going to go down well. Now I know that mercenaries is not what was intended here. It was probably the likes of G4 or whoever. That is not exactly any more reassuring, in all honesty. They have a long track record of handling migrants and asylum seekers exceedingly badly and inhumanely, notwithstanding the whole issue of sovereign integrity. So this is a very difficult proposal for the French to accept, even more so if you're going to air it publicly and trigger a strongly negative reaction from the French public to what had been proposed here. And then it gets worse. So, the next bit in the letter, Johnson completely and utterly undermined Macron in public. That is what this does here. So first he makes reference to the fact that France will soon be the president of the European Council. That's fine, that's fact. And he had then said that Macron has committed to reaching a systematic returns agreement. Now, I don't know if Macron had genuinely done this. He may not have done. Johnson may be trying to force the issue and pretending he has, especially when you're saying this sort of thing in public. But what is being implied here by this statement is that Macron had made a commitment, an agreement with the UK, even before he is president of the EU Council, and even before he even speaks to the rest of the EU and gets their consensus, their agreement to reaching this sort of agreement with the UK. So he completely undermined Macron in the eyes of the EU by saying this. So whether this is true or not, this is just something you don't say in public. Otherwise you undermine the other side's position. Exactly what Johnson done. I don't know if he'd done this deliberately. I don't know if he's just been so cack-handed. But that's effectively what he has done in this letter. So, not good. It still gets worse. Because in the next paragraph, Johnson's letter then proposes that the UK-France reach a bilateral agreement. So having supposedly undercut Macron on the EU side of things, he then said we should undercut things even further by reaching a bilateral agreement that would undermine anything the EU might agree or consent to, should we say. He then puts this, and bearing in mind the context. The context is Europe, France included, do not think the UK is doing its fair share. So here we are, a public proposal to, we're just going to deport all these migrants, asylum seekers, right back to France, or right back to the EU. It's extremely politically problematic to negotiate this, even to start with. Never mind the fact that you then undercut your partner who you're meant to negotiate with. And he puts in a bit of inflammatory language like illegal migrants and so on, which I know people will object to, with good reason. So the French response to this could never going to be a positive one. And we've seen that. We've seen that in the fact that the French have now withdrawn their invitation for the Home Secretary to come to the big shindig in Calais to discuss the migrant crisis, where the various nations of the EU are being invited. So basically, the biggest partner for this issue, or one of the bigger partners, the UK, is now not being invited. That is just astonishingly bad. You just don't really do that unless things really get bad. So this is what I talk about in my previous video about integrity, and that if you're seen as having no integrity because you've just been very underhand in how you've handled it and you've undermined your allies, then you don't get invited to the meetings. And if you don't get invited to the meetings, you don't get to be able to negotiate a solution. Other people will figure out a solution and impose it upon you. You'll just have to lump it, sort of scenario. And that is the exact result that Johnson's letter has created. Instead of opening up a negotiation channel or with various proposals, he completely shut everything down. He shut the UK out of that discussion. So we're left with the question, really, did he do that deliberately, or did he do that to sheer incompetence and lack of situational awareness? I don't have any answers to that. I don't have the evidence to support that. Obviously, people can come up with their opinions on this and draw upon various actions and activities that support those opinions. But the end result, indisputably, is that Johnson's letter has completely undermined the ability of the UK to actually negotiate a solution to the question of how to stop migrants dying in the Channel. And that is tragic. In all honesty, that's honestly nothing to be happy about. It's nothing to say I'm pleased to be right about or anything like that. It really is a dreadful situation to be in. And this is a rare insight into just how badly Johnson cocks things up on the international stage when it comes to trying to negotiate on the UK's behalf. So we don't really get to see this. We can look at it in detail. Encourage you to have a look at the letter for yourself, as well as reading the news articles. And yes, I welcome any comments upon this.